There is a strange pain that comes from trying to be a good person in a world that does not always reward goodness. You try to be kind, honest, forgiving, and patient. You try not to hurt people, even when they hurt you. But slowly, you begin to notice something disturbing. The more decent you try to be, the easier it becomes for others to use your decency against you. This is the paradox of being a good person. Goodness is supposed to make life more meaningful, more beautiful, more human. Yet in the wrong environment, goodness can become a wound. It can make you vulnerable to manipulation, betrayal, mockery, and disappointment. Not because goodness is wrong, but because goodness without wisdom walks into danger with open hands. Fyodor Dostoevsky understood this problem with terrifying clarity. He did not see goodness as something simple or sentimental. He saw it as one of the hardest things a human being could carry. In his novel, The Idiot, he created Prince Mishkin, a man of deep compassion, innocence, honesty, and spiritual purity. Then he placed him in a world ruled by pride, desire, vanity, and cruelty. The result is not a comforting story. It is not a fairy tale where kindness melts every cold heart. It is a warning. Dostoevsky shows us what happens when a truly good person enters a society that admires goodness in theory, but cannot tolerate it in reality. Mishkin does not destroy the world around him. The world around him slowly destroys him. Prince Mishkin is called an idiot, but not because he lacks intelligence. His idiocy is moral. He refuses to play the social games everyone else accepts as normal. He does not hide behind arrogance. He does not manipulate people for status. He does not pretend not to see suffering. He looks at people directly, honestly, almost too honestly, and this makes everyone uncomfortable. This is Dostoevsky's first warning. A good person can become threatening simply by being real. In a world built on masks, sincerity feels like an accusation. When everyone is performing confidence, innocence looks weak. When everyone is calculating advantage, compassion looks foolish. And when everyone has learned to lie politely, truth becomes almost offensive. People often say they want honesty, but many only want honesty that does not disturb them. They say they respect kindness, but only when it does not require them to change. They admire purity from a distance, like a beautiful painting on a wall, but when they meet someone who actually lives with an open heart, they do not know whether to protect him, laugh at him, or destroy him. That is why Mishkin is so tragic. He exposes people without trying to expose them. His goodness becomes a mirror. Around him, people see their vanity more clearly, their selfishness more clearly, their cruelty more clearly. And most people do not thank the mirror for showing them the truth. They attack it, they cover it, they try to prove it is broken. This is not just a Russian novel from the 19th century. This is still happening everywhere. A person enters a workplace with honesty, and others call them naive. A person enters a relationship with trust, and someone uses that trust as a weapon. A person refuses to become cynical, and people treat them as childish. The world often punishes what it secretly needs. The paradox is that society depends on good people, but often mistreats them. Families depend on the forgiving one. Friend groups depend on the patient one. Workplaces depend on the responsible one. Broken people depend on the compassionate one. But the person who gives the most is not always respected the most. Sometimes they are simply expected to keep giving. This is where goodness becomes dangerous for the person who carries it. Not because kindness is evil, but because kindness can be exploited by people who have no shame. A selfish person does not see your empathy as sacred, they see it as access. A manipulative person does not see your forgiveness as beautiful, they see it as permission to continue. Dostoevsky's warning is not that we should stop being good. That would be too simple and too dark. His warning is that goodness without strength is vulnerable. Goodness without discernment becomes blind. Goodness without boundaries becomes self-sacrifice. A pure heart is beautiful, but a pure heart that does not understand evil may walk directly into the hands of those who do. Many good people learn this lesson painfully. At first, they believe that if they are patient enough, people will change. If they forgive enough, people will feel remorse. If they love enough, people will finally become gentle. But sometimes love does not awaken someone's conscience. Sometimes it only teaches them how much they can take without consequences. This is the hard truth. Not everyone is transformed by your goodness. Some people are comforted by it. Some are inspired by it, but others are fed by it. They drain it. They lean on it. They use it to avoid responsibility for themselves, and the good person, because they do not want to become cruel, often stays too long, explains too much, and suffers in silence. Prince Mishkin suffers because he sees the pain inside everyone. He sees the wounded child inside the cruel person. He sees the fear behind the arrogance. He sees the loneliness behind the manipulation. And because he sees so deeply, he struggles to condemn anyone completely. This is beautiful, but it is also dangerous because understanding someone's pain does not make them safe. This is one of the most important psychological lessons in Dostoevsky. Compassion can become a trap when it removes your ability to judge. You can understand why a person became harmful and still refuse to let them harm you. You can feel sorrow for someone's wounds and still walk away from their behavior. Mercy without judgment becomes a doorway to self-destruction. Many good people confuse judgment with hatred. They think that setting a boundary means becoming cold. They think saying no means becoming selfish. They think walking away means they failed to love enough. But sometimes the most mature form of goodness is not staying. Sometimes it is refusing to participate in another person's destruction of you. There is a kind of goodness that is really fear in disguise. Fear of conflict, fear of disappointing others, fear of being disliked, fear of being seen as difficult. This kind of goodness smiles when it wants to cry. It says yes when the soul says no. It forgives before it has healed. It calls itself kindness, but underneath, it is self-abandonment. Dostoevsky forces us to ask a painful question. Are we good because we are strong, or are we good because we are afraid to be anything else? True goodness requires courage. It is not simply being harmless. It is choosing compassion while still seeing clearly. It is refusing cruelty, not because you are powerless, but because you have chosen a higher law within yourself. The world often mistakes harmlessness for goodness, but they are not the same. A harmless person may avoid hurting others because they are afraid, weak, dependent, or desperate to be accepted. A good person, in the deeper sense, has the capacity to see darkness, resist bitterness, and still choose what is right. That kind of goodness is not softness. It is strength under control. This is why Mishkin is so haunting. He is not just nice. He represents the possibility of a human being who does not respond to corruption by becoming corrupt. He carries a kind of spiritual innocence that feels almost impossible. But Dostoevsky does not present this innocence as a simple victory. He shows us how fragile it becomes when surrounded by people who cannot receive it. Because some people do not know what to do with goodness. They test it. They mock it. They try to corrupt it. They ask, is this person really good, or are they pretending? And if they discover the goodness is real, they may become even more disturbed. Genuine goodness makes the cynical person feel accused, because it proves that another way of living was possible. This is why good people are often lonely. They may be surrounded by people and still feel unknown. Their sensitivity is misunderstood. Their forgiveness is taken for weakness. Their silence is mistaken for agreement. Their patience is used as a place for others to place their chaos. And over time, they begin to feel like they are carrying a moral weight no one else can see. Then comes the dangerous moment. The good person begins to resent their own goodness. They start thinking, maybe I should become colder, maybe I should stop caring, maybe people respect cruelty more than kindness. This is the moment when the world almost wins, not when it hurts a good person, but when it convinces them that their heart was the problem. But the heart was not the problem. The lack of protection was the problem. The lack of boundaries was the problem. The lack of discernment was the problem. The good person does not need to kill their compassion. They need to educate it. They need to give it eyes, limits, standards, and the courage to walk away from what keeps poisoning it. A good person must learn that not every person deserves the same access to them. This is not cruelty. This is wisdom. You can wish someone healing without letting them close enough to keep hurting you. You can forgive someone internally without returning to the same place of humiliation. You can love humanity without handing your life to every damaged person who asks for it. Dostoevsky understood that evil is not always dramatic. It is not always a monster with a frightening face. Sometimes evil is charming, wounded, intelligent, socially admired, or emotionally persuasive. Sometimes it speaks in the language of need. Sometimes it makes you feel guilty for protecting yourself. Sometimes it turns your compassion into a contract you never agreed to sign. This is why wisdom matters. A good person who refuses to understand evil will eventually be confused by it. They will keep asking, how could someone do this? While the same pattern happens again and again. But wisdom stops asking only why people hurt others. Wisdom also asks, what must I do so this does not keep happening to me? There is nothing noble about being endlessly available to disrespect. There is nothing holy about being consumed by people who never intended to love you properly. There is nothing virtuous about losing yourself so others can remain comfortable. Self-destruction is not goodness. It is often the final form of a person who never learned that their own life also deserves protection. The truly good person must become capable of saying no without hatred. That is one of the hardest spiritual achievements, to say no without revenge, to leave without wishing destruction, to protect yourself without becoming bitter, to see someone clearly and still refuse to become cruel. This is goodness after innocence. This is kindness after awakening. In this sense, the mature good person is very different from the naive good person. The naive good person believes everyone can be reached by love. The mature good person knows some people will only use love as long as it benefits them. The naive good person gives because they hope to be valued. The mature good person gives because they choose to, and stops when giving becomes self-betrayal. This is the transformation Dostoevsky points us toward, even through tragedy. He does not allow us to treat goodness as decoration. He makes us see its cost. He shows us that to remain good in a corrupted world, a person must carry more than a soft heart. They must carry moral courage, psychological clarity, and the strength to stand alone when necessary. Because being good does not mean being easily controlled. It does not mean becoming a convenient place for other people's pain. It does not mean refusing to defend yourself. A good person can be gentle and still be dangerous to manipulation. They can be forgiving and still be unreachable to those who abuse forgiveness. They can be loving and still have a door that closes. This is the paradox. Goodness must remain open enough to love, but strong enough not to be devoured. If it closes completely, it becomes bitterness. If it opens without limits, it becomes sacrifice. The task is to live between these two dangers. To keep your heart alive without leaving it unguarded. To stay human in a world that gives you reasons not to. Maybe this is why Dostoevsky still matters. He does not give us easy comfort. He gives us a mirror. He shows that human beings are capable of beauty, cruelty, tenderness, vanity, faith, and destruction, often at the same time. And he asks us whether goodness can survive when it stops being innocent and begins to understand what it is up against. The answer is not simple. Some forms of goodness will not survive. The goodness that depends on approval will break. The goodness that cannot say no will be consumed. The goodness that mistakes suffering for love will collapse. But another kind of goodness can survive. Goodness with wisdom, goodness with courage, goodness with boundaries, goodness that has seen darkness and still refuses to worship it. So if you have ever felt punished for being a good person, do not rush to become cruel. Cruelty may look powerful, but it is often just fear wearing armor. Do not bury the best part of yourself because the wrong people mishandled it. Refine it, strengthen it, teach it discernment. Let your kindness become something chosen, not something extracted from you. A good person who has awakened is not easy prey. They do not need to announce their strength. It appears in what they no longer tolerate. It appears in the silence after a boundary. It appears in the peace they protect. It appears in the way they can still care but no longer collapse. They have not stopped being good. They have stopped being available for destruction. This may be Dostoevsky's warning to the world. If goodness is not protected, the world will crucify it, mock it, use it, and call it foolish. But if goodness becomes wise, it becomes one of the rarest forces on earth. Not naive, not sentimental, not weak, but luminous, disciplined, and difficult to corrupt. A goodness that does not beg the world to understand it. The goal is not to become less kind. The goal is to become more truthful, to stop confusing love with self-erasure, to stop confusing patience with silence, to stop confusing forgiveness with unlimited access. A good person does not need to become a monster to survive among monsters, but they must stop walking through the world as if monsters do not exist. In the end, the tragedy of the good person is not that they are too good for the world. It is that they often believe goodness alone will protect them. Dostoevsky shows us that it will not. Goodness needs wisdom. Compassion needs boundaries. Love needs truth. And the pure heart, if it wants to survive, must learn not only how to suffer, but how to see. Because the world may destroy innocence, but it cannot easily destroy awakened goodness. It cannot easily control a person who is kind without being naive, forgiving without being blind, and gentle without being weak. That person has entered the paradox and survived it. They are still good, but now their goodness has a spine, and that changes everything. Dostoevsky's warning is not that good people should stop being good. His warning is that goodness without wisdom becomes fragile. A pure heart is beautiful, but purity alone cannot survive a world full of manipulation, vanity, and hidden cruelty. If goodness wants to remain alive, it must learn how to see clearly, how to say no, and how to protect itself without becoming bitter. The tragedy of the good person is not kindness itself. The tragedy is believing that kindness will always be understood, respected, or returned. Some people will admire your heart, others will test it, some will be healed by it, others will try to feed on it, and this is why a good person must learn that compassion is sacred, but access to that compassion should never be unlimited. To remain good after disappointment is one of the hardest things a human being can do. It is easy to become cold after betrayal. It is easy to call cruelty strength and numbness wisdom. But the rarest kind of person is the one who sees the darkness clearly and still refuses to become it. Not naive, not blind, not harmless, but kind with boundaries, gentle with strength, and loving with truth. So maybe the goal is not to be a good person in the innocent sense. Maybe the goal is to become an awakened good person, someone who can forgive without returning to the cage, someone who can love without disappearing, someone who can care without being consumed. Because the world may destroy naive goodness, but it cannot easily destroy goodness with a spine.